tonight's talk I titled it Rhythms of Becoming, and it was it was inspired in me by two lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave, one in December of 1908 and the other in January of 1909, on the rhythms in the being of man. And so we're going to take a journey not only through the rhythms that are discussed in those two lectures, but some of the other places where rhythm shows up specifically in what Rudolf Steiner is describing as a way to, for me at least, to try to research and understand how can I have a meaningful engagement with the rhythms that are now culminating in the anthroposophical movement. Because this year, 2022, we will come to the significant anniversary of the fire that destroyed the first Goetheanum. Then next year, we will have the 100th anniversary of the Christmas conference, and then the last address, and then Rudolf Steiner's death. And how can we, through the lens of the rhythm of time, understand the meaning of these things now, but also how to be prepared, because it's, I think, it's just an awesome opportunity for us to be in the world at this time while these things are happening. So I'm just going to start right away. All right, so this very first quote comes from the lecture, the January lecture, Rhythms in the Being of Man, where Rudolf Steiner asks, how can a knowledge of the rhythms in the being of man help us understand in a deeper way both the necessity and the object of the anthroposophical movement? And so I think that this is very striking, because he's placing a very strong emphasis on the fact that looking through the rhythms that we can come to greater understanding, not only of ourselves, but to understand the necessity of anthroposophy in the world. And so I just wanted to remind us that last year, I gave a talk in May. It was the eve of Ascension Day, and we looked at Rudolf Steiner's birth and also at the births of his parents. So his father, Johannes, was born at the eve of the Feast of St. John. His mother, Franziska, was born at Ascension Day. They were married at the eve of Ascension Day. And then Rudolf Steiner was born almost exactly 9 months later. So I was pointing out that this was a 9-month rhythm, but we'll see in what I'm about to describe from this lecture on the rhythms in the being of man, that another way that Rudolf Steiner refers to this kind of rhythm is that it's 10 times 4 times 7, or 280 days. And although Sandra and I didn't plan this on purpose, here it is, almost exactly 280 days after last year's lecture, and here we are again. So this is a rhythm that sounds in the physical body, and I think it's really poetic. It's not just a coincidence that we planted a seed there, and now here we are having an experience again. And so this next slide is a quote from this lecture. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is the part at the very beginning of the lecture on the rhythms in the being of man from January of 1909, where Rudolf Steiner is describing how the ego has a rhythm of one. And he says, okay, so we have, as a human being, we have an experience of being awake and being asleep. And then when we wake again, the ego body has returned back to the place where it began. But then that the astral body has a slower rhythm, and that it takes about 7 days before the astral body will return to repeat at the place where it started. And so there's this relationship of 1 to 7 between the ego and the astral body. And then he goes on to describe how with the etheric, it's different yet again. The etheric body has a rotational speed that's much slower, and that he doesn't just say it's 28 days, he says it's 4 times 7. So we start to have this relationship between 1 with the ego body, and then 1 times 7 with the astral body, and then 4 times 7 returns of the astral body gets us to the return of the etheric. And then he says with the physical body, it's a little more challenging to have an exact rhythm, particularly because when one is incarnate in a female body, the etheric body will be male, and vice versa with the male, but that it's roughly 280 days, or 10 times the etheric rhythm, which is 4 times 7 days. So that's when we get this part that I've bolded at the bottom, where he describes that on the whole, the numbers 1 to 7 to 4 times 7 to 10 times 4 times 7 are the proportional figures that, so to say, specify the speeds of rotation for the 4 members of man's being. Okay, so you don't have to memorize this, but I'm going to draw attention to the etheric rhythm. And the reason I want to do this is because the great mystery of our era has to do with the reappearance of the Christ in the etheric realm. And so anything that I feel I can do to strengthen an awareness of etheric rhythms may potentially strengthen the capacity for having that experience. So I'm going to, in my next slide, assume that most of us observed the holy nights. So I've just got up here the 1 through 12, and I've put the dates beneath them through my dear friend Tamara Slayton, who first introduced me to the holy nights in the 1990s. She took the moment of midnight on New Year's Eve to New Year's Day apart from the sequence of nights during that season and didn't count it as one of the nights. So you still end up with January 5th being the 12th night. Okay, so this was a period of time where potentially all of us did some type of focused or artistic activity that it's probably pretty easy to remember, and potentially you have some record of it, having reviewed a journal, anticipated what's coming in the next year, looking back at the year that was completing at the end of 2021, but something that is still tangible that we can still take hold of. And then looking at this with this idea that we undertake this exercise or this practice, this observance during the holy nights, 28 days later, the etheric body is returning, you could say, to that place where we were doing this work. And so it's an easy thing to get hold of, to start to do some research about, can I sense the etheric in this? So the first kind of sounding out of the etheric return from the holy nights would have started on January 21st and gone all the way until February 2nd to the 3rd. So this second row of numbers is 28 days after the top row of numbers. So the imagination is that this could potentially start to build a structure wherein we could begin to think about etheric rhythms. And noticeably, on January 25th, we have the Feast of Paul. Now, Paul figures significantly in Rudolf Steiner's delivery about his announcement about the reappearance of the Christ in the etheric. He first gave his lecture about this mystery at the Feast of St. Paul in 1910. And so I think it is not insignificant that Paul's experience on the road to Damascus is as the precursor for the rest of humanity that will come into an encounter with the Christ being in the etheric, and that the feast of that event happens one etheric rhythm from the holy nights. So this has something to do with becoming aware in this time in the cycle of the year that what is born, this spirit child that is freed from enchantment at the Christmas time, is now in one full etheric rhythm expressing itself. And then I personally think that it's worth it to go all the way from the holy nights to the Holy Week, looking at this 28-day rhythm, particularly because Rudolf Steiner describes how at Christmas time, we can have an experience of the Christ being as though through an archangel, and then this being moves with us from Christmas through Easter. And knowing that this being is in the etheric realm, then taking hold of this etheric rhythm, I think can really, for me at least, start to make more clear how this actually happens, how this experience comes about. So the second 28-day rhythm from the Holy Nights will begin on February 18th and go until March 2nd and 3rd. Sandra, I can share this slide with you afterwards so that if anybody wants this, you don't have to furiously write all these things down, but you could also just do the math. You just keep adding 28 days all the way through. So in that second 28-day rhythm, we have the Feast of Matthias, which we talked about last May. Matthias is the only apostle that is chosen by his fellow human beings, and it's his arriving in this community of 11 that completes the circle, so that now the flaming tongues and the rushing winds of the Pentecost are released, and that Whitsun mystery takes place. And this is happening on the eve of the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's birth. So Rudolf Steiner, born on February 25th, this is the second etheric rhythm after New Year's Eve, which I think has a certain mystery in it, because he speaks about New Year's Eve as a division of time, that it's not happenstance, that we have New Year's Eve happening at that moment in the cycle of the year, and that the old year is actually done and we step into the new. And two etheric rhythms from that time, this is when Rudolf Steiner is born. And then this year, this won't be true every year because Easter is a movable feast day. Lent will begin on March 2nd. And so that's the end of the second 28-day rhythm. Then the third 28-day rhythm will happen between March 18th and the 31st. And so during that time, we will cross through the spring equinox. We also come to the Feast of the Annunciation, which used to be the beginning of the new year, still considered the beginning of the spiritual new year. Dante's Divine Comedy begins on the Feast of Annunciation. So this is the annunciation of the Archangel Gabriel to Mary, should she choose to accept this annunciation from the spiritual world, that she will give birth to the Christ child, as it's described in the Luke Gospel. So on the eve of that feast day of the Annunciation is the feast of the Archangel Gabriel. So now we can see in this 28-day rhythm, it's quite interesting that the Feast of Matthias is 28 days before the Feast of Gabriel. Rudolf Steiner's birth is 28 days before the Feast of Annunciation. I'm just looking for a narrative, something that might reveal that this is how etheric forces are working through my experience of the cycle of the year. And then March 30th to 31st, we come to the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death in 1925. And then the fourth etheric rhythm, so 4 times 28 times, will happen starting the week of, April 15th, and it will conclude on April 27th and 28th. So April 15th this year is Good Friday. The vernal full moon will happen on April 16th, which is Holy Saturday. And then just a few hours later, the Easter sun will rise on April 17th. Okay, so this is just a framework for doing research. If I can become aware of this 28-day rhythm of the etheric body, knowing that I made a concentrated effort during the Holy Nights to review not only my own biography and what had happened in the year past, anticipating the year ahead, but in my case, it was looking into the new images of the zodiac and trying to pay attention to what was occurring then that might sound out in any one of these 4 stages from now, from the Holy Nights until Christmas, or excuse me, until Easter. But so you can see that this year, Good Friday is going to be the 4th 28-day rhythm from the first Holy Night. So from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, birth of the Christ child, the spirit child in one's soul is freed from enchantment. And then 28 days will pass 4 times and it will be Good Friday. Then we can see that Easter will be coming 1 28-day rhythm after spring equinox, but these two align with the 3rd Holy Night. And then we see that the feast of Paul's conversion is 28 days after the 5th Holy Night. So this will always be the case because that's not a movable feast day. If we go according to the 12 days of Christmas, then Paul's feast happens 28 days after the 5th day of Christmas. And a Dutch Waldorf teacher, Eva Meus, wrote a beautiful little article about the 12 days of Christmas. And she describes how the first 4 days, the gifts that come in this song, you know, on the 12th day of Christmas, I'm hoping we all know the song, but they're birds. And then when we get to the 5th day, something different happens. Now it's gold. The rhythm changes and there are 5 golden rings. And that this represents a union of the Son being, or the Christ being, with the earthly humanity and the heart of the human being, which is really beautiful when we think of this 28-day rhythm from the 5th day of Christmas to the conversion of Paul at the gates of Damascus and his experience of the etheric Christ. That already a seed for it is there during the Holy Nights, and that we can begin to awaken to this. And then, as I was pointing out, from December 31st to January 1st, the 28-day rhythm will sound out twice, and we arrive at the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's birth. And then the 3rd 28-day rhythm, we come to the Feast of Annunciation. And then this year, we have from the 12th Holy Night, we will have a 28-day rhythm that brings us to the beginning of Lent, and then also to the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death. So as I shared, I can copy this slide and send it to Sandra so that anybody that might be interested in it can have it. And I just want to show you that I don't like it being just in straight lines. I tried to paint it. And then I realized that, oh, it probably isn't really in straight lines at all. I just drew it then in a circle. So just to really try to work with it and imagine what does it look like. He talks about this speed of rotation and something circling and returning back, and he's describing in this lecture on the beings and the rhythms in the being of man, that we can imagine the bodies in relationship to one another like the hands of a clock. So specifically like the minute hand and the hour hand. So the minute hand would be the astral body and the hour hand would be the etheric, and that by the time the etheric gets around to where they've moved on, so they have to keep catching up with one another. This is also true with the moon and the earth, because what happens is the moon will make one orbit of the earth and come back to the place where it started. This is called its sidereal rhythm, takes it just a little bit over 27 days, but it's not back at new phase again because the earth has moved on. And so it takes a couple days for the moon to catch up with the earth and the sun again, to come to that relationship where we then have a new moon. And that ends up taking almost 29 days. So we've got this rhythm of time between the sidereal and the synodic rhythms of the moon's orbit around the earth, where something new enters in, you could say. And so we have this experience also in our bodies. This is what Rudolf Steiner is pointing to and saying, okay, the rhythm of the ego body is 1, the rhythm of the astral body is 7, the rhythm of the etheric is 4 times 7, and the rhythm of the physical is 10 times 7 times 4. And so that's my next slide, is then to show how he's describing in The Human Soul in the Universe from 1917. He's saying in this lecture that, of course, we talk about the human being as a being fourfold in nature, with the ego body, the astral body, the etheric, and the physical, but that in rudimentary form, we already carry within ourselves the higher members of our being. So that when the ego body can actually work through and penetrate the astral body, then we can awaken the spirit self, and that then this can impress into the etheric, which gives rise to life spirit. And then ultimately, when the egoic forces can work all the way through into the physical, then we have spirit man. So I just wanted to reiterate these rhythms again. So with the ego body, it's the rhythm of 1. With the astral body, it's the rhythm of 7, or you could say 1 week, so that this rhythm is the amount of time it takes for the astral body to come back to its starting point. With the etheric body, it's the rhythm of 4 times 7. And I think it's really specific what Rudolf Steiner is doing in expressing it that way. He's not just saying it's 28 days. He's saying it's 4 times the astral rhythm. So these bodies remain in relationship with one another. The astral body is 7 times the egoic rhythm. And then when he's describing the physical body, it's 10 times 4 times 7. So 10 times for the physical times the 4 times 7 of the etheric that is related to the astral. So deeply connected to one another. And then this, I think, sets up a framework for looking not only at the holy nights, but we could use this to look into any part of our biography. You could take any particular moment. It's like the karma exercise, and you could say, okay, I will follow this through a 1 week rhythm, or a 4 times 7 days rhythm, or a 280 day rhythm. Can I hold a thought, an idea, a meditative thought that long and see, is it working in these bodies? And of course, in order to do this, you have to be keeping a journal. Like, you have to be keeping track. And it's not just, here's how I felt today, but more, I think about journaling as a way to describe the day in such a way that when I get 280 days down the road and I want to come back and remember that day, what elements did I need to record so that I can reconstruct it in my memory body, which is my etheric. And so it's really about exercising these bodies, and being aware of these rhythms allows us to take, I think it allows us to take advantage of that, and to really begin to articulate which body is it that I'm working with, if we're really good at being able to discern the events, the significant events that are taking place in each day. So we do this not only by review at the end of the day, but then also in the Eightfold Path and the practice of discerning, being able to distinguish between the trivial and the significant. And so to really try to bring a certain amount of harmony into our finer bodies. All right, so now I want to look at a couple of ways that this shows up in Rudolf Steiner's work. And also this out of this idea that we are preparing to come into the 100-year fulfillment of some really important events. And my question to myself is, can paying attention to these rhythms help me to be aware of what is it that's taking place now 100 years down the road from when these ideas were first being introduced? And so this is a quote from the first lecture that Rudolf Steiner gave at the Feast of Paul in 1910, where he heralded this event about the true nature of the second coming. And I will just read it out. The Christ will return, however, in an etheric form in the period of which we have been speaking. And he had been talking about the decade of the 1930s. Then human beings will learn to perceive Christ, because through this etheric vision, they will grow upward toward him who no longer descends as far into a physical body, but only into an etheric body. It will therefore be necessary for human beings to grow upward to a perception of Christ. For Christ spoke truly when he said, "I am with you always, even unto the end of the earth." He is here. He is in our spiritual world, and those who are especially blessed can perceive him always in the spiritual etheric world. And when I first learned about this lecture, it was through Hazel Straker, the astrosopher that worked with Willy Zucker in 1995. And she was making the observing that, at least according to what she knew about this event when Rudolf Steiner first spoke about the etheric Christ, that the day he was to give this lecture, there was a cross, an astrological cross in the heavens, and then he was asked by his hosts either to change his subject or to pick another day. And he said, "No, I'm coming on that day, and this is my subject." And of course, this subject about the reappearance of the Christ in the etheric is intimately connected to Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. And that Rudolf Steiner holds Paul up as a demonstration or an example of what the human being can experience now of the Christ being after the physical incarnation, that it will no longer happen in the physical world, but that this will happen now etherically, and that we must lift ourselves up into the etheric to have that experience. And so paying attention to the rhythm of the etheric body for me is one of the ways that I hope that this can be strengthened. And then also, in the 1983 translation of this lecture, Rene Querido did the introduction, and he points out that in August of 1910, then with the opening of the mystery dramas at the Portal of Initiation, Rudolf Steiner then has Theodora speak from the stage about this mystery. And so he's given the description of it through a lecture and then an artistic rendering of it, not quite 280 days later, 8 months later. And so there's a rhythm of time. He's sounding something out and then continues to work with it rhythmically. And so I would just like to read these words of Theodora from the Portal of Initiation, and to think of them in relationship to then what Rudolf Steiner actually spoke when he gave this lecture. A human being emerges from glowing light. It says to me, "You shall proclaim to all who have the will to hear that you have seen what human beings soon will experience. Christ once lived on earth, and from his life it follows that as soul he embraces human growth on earth. He is united with the spiritual part of earth, but human beings cannot yet behold him in the form in which he reveals himself, because they lack the eyes of the spirit that will be theirs. Now the time draws near when, with new power of sight, human beings on earth will be endowed. What once the senses could behold when Christ lived on the earth will be perceived by human souls." Sometimes there just aren't words, but this is such a powerful opportunity. And we have passed the 100-year mark from when Rudolf Steiner first spoke about this mystery. But we have not yet come to the 100-year fulfillment of the decade in which he said this would begin. And when I get toward the end, you'll see why I keep laying emphasis on the 100-year rhythm because again, in addition to the bodily rhythms of the 1, the 7, 4 times 7, 10 times 7 times 4, there's also other rhythms that are sounding out. But I would also still just like to tease out a little bit more out of this etheric rhythm by looking at the calendar of the soul verses, beginning with verse 1 from Easter, and then looking 28 days later at the verse 4, and then 28 days after that, verse 8, to see. And you may not agree with me, but I, again, offer this as a research opportunity to try to imagine, is there a languaging of the etheric body in these 28-day rhythms through the calendar of the soul? So what I see in verse 1 is a description of the thoughts soared to distances of space and dimly bind the human being to the spirit's life. 28 days later, we have this reference to the feeling would give warmth and firmly bind as one the human being and the world. So first we hear this dimly bind, then we hear firmly bind. And of course, this is in translation. This is the Hans Pusch translation. I don't have German, so I cannot say whether it's expressing itself that way, but at least I'm hearing a certain relationship there. And then 28 days later, we now have this union. So first something is being dimly bound, firmly bound, and now it's united. And so that which is being dimly bound in the first verse is the human being to the spirit's life. In the second verse, it is the human being to the world. And then in the third verse, it is this union of the divine with my soul. And so I'm allowing myself that perhaps this is a way to begin to sense this etheric rhythm, that it takes 28 days for this, what's sounding out in the first verse of the calendar of the soul, that is this dimly bound, now to be firmly bound, then to come to union. And you could look through the whole cycle of the year. I just wanted to put this up here as a suggestion of one way. You can also go in reverse and say, okay, what was 28 days before this moment? So it's not confined to just going in one direction. It's not just going toward the future. It's also potentially potential for us to go into the past. So then, again, looking at this etheric rhythm, I wanted to consider this very well-known verse, "The stars spoke once to man," which Rudolf Steiner gave to Mary Steiner at Christmas 1922. The stars spoke once to man. It is world destiny that they are silent now. To become aware of this silence can be pain for earthly humanity. But in the deepening silence, there grows and ripens what human beings speak to the stars. To become aware of this speaking can become strength for spirit man. So this was at Christmas 1922. And we know that the astral body has a rhythm of 7. So 7 days after Rudolf Steiner gave this verse to Mary Steiner was December 31st, 1922. And so that makes me want to look at, is there any relationship between the mystery of this verse in what was being spoken that evening and then the fire that happened? Not that I'm not looking for a causal relationship, just looking to see, is there something that reveals itself? And I'm not going to answer that question. It's just a question. He was giving the lecture in which he was talking about I think he says, the first thing that must come to pass if anthroposophy is to make its way in the world is that life, we must recognize, let's see, the first beginning of what must come to pass if anthroposophy is to fulfill its mission in the world is that the human being's whole relationship to the world must be recognized to be one of cosmic ritual. And this cosmic ritual, I think, is connected to our ability to speak to the stars. So he gives this verse to Mary Steiner. One astral rhythm later, he speaks these words about the cosmic ritual. But then 28 days later, so after the fire, after New Year's Day, 28 days later, he's giving a lecture on fall and redemption. It's the 21st of January, 1923. So it's one etheric rhythm after Christmas, 1922. After he's given this verse to Mary Steiner, that has this mystery about our speaking now to the stars. And here I think he starts to give an answer to that. And I would like to read this. Today, the time has come when Christ must be understood, but we resist this understanding of Christ, and the form this resistance takes is extraordinarily characteristic. You see, if even a spark of what Christ really is still lived in those who say that they understand Christ, what would happen? They would have to be clear about the fact that Christ, as a heavenly being, descended to earth. He therefore did not speak to man in an earthly language, but in a heavenly one. We must therefore make an effort to understand him. We must make an effort to speak a cosmic extraterrestrial language. That means that we must not limit our knowledge merely to the earth, for the earth was in fact a new land for Christ. We must extend our knowledge out into the cosmos. We must learn to understand the elements. We must learn to understand the movements of the planets. We must learn to understand the star constellations and their influence on what happens on earth. Then we draw near to the language that Christ spoke. I feel very strongly that these two things are connected. This call to the human being to become aware of how we not only are, but must become aware of our speaking to the stars, and that this is also connected to our lifting ourselves up to an experience of the Christ being in the spiritual etheric of the earth. And here, 28 days after giving this verse to Mary Steiner, then he speaks specifically about how we can start to do this. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears away from the 28-day rhythm and point to something that I think is really beautiful in the Rudolf Steiner's biography. And that has to do with a passage that shows up in the portal of initiation. So this is my attempt. I can't take a picture of this stream at night, but this is a description of a young boy by a well at night, off in the woods in the dark, watching the moonlight. Once upon a time, there was a boy who lived, the only child of a poor forester within a woodland solitude. He knew besides his parents hardly any other people. This is a really beautiful passage. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to point out that there's a very significant indication of a biographical rhythm in this part of this mystery drama. So this is scene 5 from the portal of initiation, and this is Felicia telling a story. And so she goes on to describe how at evening his anxious parents from time to time missed their beloved child. The boy was at a spot nearby, where from the rocks a spring burst forth, and water drops dispersing thousandfold were scattered over stones. When moonlight's silver glance in sparkling colors sorcery was mirrored in the water's misty spray, the boy could sit for hours on end beside the rock-born spring, and figures formed by spirit magic arose before his youthful eyes. So then he goes on to describe these 3 women's forms that appear, and how the first gathers the spray and hands it to the second, who fashions it into a chalice and hands it to the third, who gives it to the boy. And then in the next part, and then so at that night he has a dream, and that night he has a dream that a dragon comes and steals the chalice from him. But then he has Felicia go on to describe how, and here comes a rhythm, when 360 weeks had run their course 3 times, the boy had long become a man and left his parents' home and forest country to live in a strange city. So 3 times 360 weeks is 21 years. And so it's sometimes said that this is an autobiographical account of Rudolf Steiner's, and that this was happening when he was around the age of 7. So 21 years later, he would have been 28. So coming to the first Saturn return. And then what goes on, what Felicia continues to describe then is that when he's living in this urban environment, remote from this woodland majesty of his childhood, that one evening he has an experience of these 3 forms again, who reveal to him that they have always been with him and that they can give him strength and that he can call on them. And then he has a dream that night that now, rather than the dragon stealing the chalice from him, the dragon is circling around but can't get near him. And so this is a really beautiful description of a 21-year rhythm, but also of an initiation experience that can be carried through the life and sounds out in several different ways in Rudolf Steiner's biography, because not only does it show up in the mystery dramas, but Walter Johannes Stein, in speaking about in his book, The Ninth Century and the Holy Grail, in the introduction, he describes how when he was teaching his students about the Holy Grail, Rudolf Steiner came in and started to participate with Stein in describing to the students about the mystery of the poem by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And he goes on to, I would like to just read this passage. Okay, I've got my 360 weeks 3 times. But this from Walter Johannes Stein, recalling what Rudolf Steiner said to his students. I will read this. What I want you to do is listen for this description that comes from the mystery drama, and to imagine Rudolf Steiner, the young child that's having this experience, and now he's speaking to the students out of his own experience, but not saying, I had this experience, but describing to them about this quest for the Grail. Each seeker of the Grail must begin at the point where the Grail sword is welded together. He who would continue the narrative must come provided with the fragments of the sword, and must appear beside the rock that is unillumined by the sunlight of waking consciousness. Here, at the source of inspiration, at the well of Cunavare, as Wolfram von Eschenbach names the woman who guards the spring, the spiritual sword that will again be made whole, the spiritual sword will again be made whole out of the fragments of lingering tradition. So to me, this is a really beautiful description of an initiation experience he had, and why he would say something like the path of anthroposophy is a Grail path, and that this encounter, he had actually a waking living encounter near a well in a wood at night with the moonlight shining down on it, and being able to encounter the elemental forces and the elemental beings of that world, and that this sounded out again in a 21-year rhythm, and then becomes a significant part of the mystery of teaching about how we find our way on that Grail path. I think it's just really a lovely coming together, or kind of an illumination of a sounding of a rhythm, and how we can find this in our own lives if we look at those significant moments that have left not just a lasting impression, that doesn't seem like the right kind of a word, but something that has really fashioned the path, the life work and the striving, and to look into the rhythms of one's life and see if you can find the 28-day rhythm, or the 280-day rhythm, or the 360 weeks 3 times rhythm, to see that this is an impression that's coming from the spiritual world through the ego body to the astral, to the etheric, and ultimately into the physical. So now I'm going to shift gears again and talk about this 100-year rhythm. And this comes from, I have it in the secret stream, but from Rudolf Steiner's lecture on Who Was Christian Rosenkreuz from September of 1911. And this, for me, is really significant right now, because 1922 starts to sound out these 100-year rhythms. The 100th anniversary, first of the fire, then of the Christmas conference, then the last address, and then Rudolf Steiner's crossing over the threshold. But then also in 2030, we're going to get to the 100-year rhythm from this beginning of the Christ experience in the etheric. It was established by the first Rosicrucians that all their discoveries had to remain their secret for 100 years. Not until 100 years had passed could these Rosicrucian revelations be divulged to the world. Not until they had worked at them for 100 years could they speak of them in an appropriate way. So when I think about this, it occurs to me that a Rosicrucian that might be doing a certain type of work that would bring a revelation is probably already an adult, probably already at the first Saturn return, which would mean in order to hold something for 100 years, it would be you know, this individual might be 130 years old by the time it would be that what was revealed had been worked through. So to me, this suggests that not only must we take spiritual knowledge, spiritual revelation across the threshold each night in sleep and back into wakefulness, but also across the threshold of death into the spiritual world and with us back into rebirth. And so in looking at the 100-year rhythms in the anthroposophical movement, that something was given, and that something wasn't just going to go on a continuous trajectory. It also went across the threshold with all those that were contemporaries of Rudolf Steiner, who then died and then have potentially have come back into life again to be present at the time that this 100-year rhythm is beginning to sound out. And so this is, I first learned of this in the T.H. Myers biography of D.N. Dunlop about the Michael prophecy, that there would be an opportunity for a quick reincarnation of those who so chose, who were so committed to an anthroposophical path, that they would potentially reincarnate again before the end of the 20th century. I think that sometimes this is interpreted as meaning that something had to happen by the end of the 20th century. That's something what I want to believe is that what had to happen is that you had to incarnate again before the end of the 20th century to be of an age so that when these 100-year rhythms are sounding out, that which was revealed originally could now begin to live in the consciousness. Now it had been worked with appropriately through waking and sleeping, also in death and rebirth, and finding anthroposophy again, and now working with it and being prepared in a certain respect for what can now come into the world as a result of this 100-year rhythm being fulfilled. Okay, so the last thing I want to look at in this is related to the cycle of the planet Venus, which will make 5 retrograde loops over every 8-year period of time. And so the planet Venus is in a current cycle that you could say began on January 8th, 2022. 8 years from now, it will come back to the same region of the zodiac and come conjunct the sun on Epiphany, January 6th, 2030. And 2030 will be the 100th anniversary of this, I don't want to call it an anniversary, but a 100-year fulfillment of this time during which Rudolf Steiner says the beginning of an experience of the Christ in the etheric will start to happen. And so now thinking about this, that he revealed, this was a revelation that then needed to be taken in by his contemporaries and worked with in waking and sleeping, and also in death and rebirth. And when we come to this 100-year rhythm in 2030, Venus will complete its 8-year cycle from right now. So right now we're at the beginning of this 8-year cycle. And what Venus does in its retrograde loops is make this pattern that appears to carve out a pentagram around the earth with the sun. And the pentagram, of course, is significant because it informs the geometric shape of the pentagon, which is the flat surface that is on the regular dodecahedron. So a regular dodecahedron is a 12-sided object, and each of the flat surfaces is a pentagon. And as you know, the foundation stone itself is a 12-sided double dodecahedron. So the macrocosm laid into the microcosm, and then this, okay, I didn't mean to say this, but here I am, I'm going to say it, that the deed of laying the actual physical foundation stone into the earth is the culmination of a certain mystery rite, you could say, and that then almost 10 years later at the Christmas conference, when Rudolf Steiner then lays this foundation stone as a meditation into the hearts of the human beings that so align themselves, that this is a reversal of that ritual. You could say that the word is set into stone, and then through the Christmas conference, that word is removed from the stone and becomes a living experience and the foundation for how we begin to speak to the stars. And so for me, this is both really exciting and also very daunting to be an anthroposophist at this time when the 100-year rhythms are fulfilling from when these deeds were undertaken by Rudolf Steiner, and to be a witness to that both through studying his lectures, looking at the historical account and the historical record, but actually living in the first sounding out of this mystery when now as Rudolf Steiner said in the quote that I had on the last slide, that the time will have passed when we have been given the opportunity to work with it in an appropriate way. And now it can come into the world. So I am going to talk more about this 8-year Venus cycle, but not tonight. I just want to place it there as something that we could also be thinking about, that Venus is making an interesting gesture in relationship to the time that we're in right now. The last Venus pentagram, you could say it started in 2012 when Venus transited the sun, and then that came to completion in 2020. So from 2012, when Venus, like Prometheus, stole fire from the sun, wove a pentagram around the earth, and then we get to 2020, a very significant year. Venus completed its first pentagram. And now you could say that the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in 2020 is informing this next 8-year cycle of Venus, which will take us all the way to 2030, to Epiphany, and to the beginning of the 100th year rhythm from the appearance of the Christ in the etheric. All right, so my last slide is just to show what's coming up in the sky. So at the end of this month, this will be, I think, a remarkable thing to get up for. If you don't stay up too late at night like me, and you can get up on the other end of the day, looking east about 45 minutes before the sun rises, you'll see Venus and Mars. And particularly on February 27th, the day that Rudolf Steiner was baptized, the moon will be very close to Venus and Mars. And they are also about to come conjunct the now dwarf planet Pluto, and this will be Venus's third meeting with Pluto in its since December. Venus met Pluto on December 11th, then again on the 25th, and then again on March 2nd. So Venus is very active in the sky right now. And then I also just wanted to share, I have some things coming up. So if you don't mind, I just thought I would put it up there. So I am going to, Judith was asking about this at the beginning when we were just chatting. I'm going to host a Lenten study of the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, not only because I love it and it's quite humorous and it's very challenging, but also because of its unique relationship to Venus. And then also I will be speaking about this 8-year Venus rhythm with the Chicago branch on the Feast of Annunciation, March 25th. And then I will be in Santa Fe for the Sophia Rising conference that's happening at the end of April, which is the 4th 28-day rhythm from the Holy Nights. And then this summer in July, I will be in Wilton, New Hampshire, all things going in a healthy trajectory toward that time, looking at, well, I've called it Cosmic Cycles, Earthly Rhythms, but looking at great works of literature and how we can find relationship to the stars through that.